Okay, rocking right on with Petrophysics Rocks, my new YouTube channel. The next installment is the fluid chapter. I hope you've managed to catch up on the first three or four presentations in this series of Petrophysics for Dummies. If you could like and subscribe and click down below and put some comments in as well. Remember, those comments might be giving you some good ideas for future episodes. But the next thing we've got to know is the fluid type. Remember, we talked about the bread last time and what soaked into the bread. Well, how do we know what the fluid is? So here we are with a fluid carrier. We've got to work out what's the fluid in here. Is it water? Is it oil? Who knows what's soaked in? So what we do is take a couple of electrodes and dip it in there, and if it's resistive, it's more likely to be oil, and if it conducts electricity, it's water with salt in it and stuff. So anyway, I'm ad-libbing now, but why don't we go to the next presentation, which is the fluid typing. So we know what the holes are, we know how much capacity the bread has, the rock has, and now we're going to go and see if we can measure how much what type of fluid we have in our reservoirs. Okay.
So the next thing we need to measure is the fluid type. Obviously, knowing the storativity, the amount of pore space available to us, we need to know what type of fluid is in that pore space. Now, obviously, in the oil business, we hope it's filled with oil, but it's a bit of a hit and miss approach sometimes. So sometimes we drill wells and we don't encounter any oil, and sometimes we just log water wells. And it's important that we can tell the difference between the two. Okay, so if I put some fluid into this formation now, let me just fill this up here. You see it filling up nicely from the bottom. And what we have here is some blue water over here, and I've got some green oil floating on the top of it, and some red gas floating on the top of that. So as long as you don't work for Shell, that would make some sense to you. Traditionally, gas is coloured in red, except if you work for Shell, and they do it the other way around. But so here we have our reservoir, our pore space filled with these fluids sitting one on top of the other. Obviously the oil floats on top of the water, and the gas here that I've put in floats on top of that too. So how do we determine what fluid is in our reservoir? Well, we make what's called some resistivity measurements, resistivity logging. Okay, so we place our tool again into the wellbore, and we have a transmitter and a receiver, and in general we have two types of resistivity measurements. Actually there are three, but I'll just talk about two for now. There's what I'll call a direct measurement, and that's one where you beam an electric current directly into the formation. You have a conductive connectivity between the tool and the formation, and you beam an electric current into it, and you measure the resistance of the rock to that electric current. Or what I'm calling an indirect measurement here, where you have an induction tool which induces a current in the reservoir. Basically, an induction tool has an alternating current which it sends through some coils in it, downhole, and this alternating current creates a fluctuating magnetic field around the tool, and this magnetic field, the fluctuating magnetic field, actually in turn induces a current to flow in the formation itself. And then the movement of this current around the tool actually again in turn induces this magnetic field induces a current back in the receiver coil within the tool, and the received current is proportional to the current flow in the formation, and hence from that you can get an idea of the conductivity of the formation, and 1 over that is the resistivity. So we've got a direct measurement in conductive muds, and an indirect measurement where we induce a current to flow in the formation and measure the tool's response to that. So you may recall from your school physics that water can conduct electricity if it has salt in it, if it has salts in it, and commonly natural waters all tend to have salts in them to some degree. The higher the salinity, the more salt in it, the more electricity it can conduct, so the lower the resistivity. But generally most of the waters that we encounter in nature can conduct electricity. And so the more porosity we have in the system, the more storativity, the bigger the volume of water, the easier it is generally for electrons to flow through and conduct current. So what we tend to find is that in bigger porosity, water-bearing rocks are more conductive than rocks with less porosity, simply because they have more volume of this conductive water in the way. Okay, so the second thing we're interested in, and primarily what pays our wages in the oil industry, is oil. And of course oil itself is non-conductive, so it's an insulator. So if we put oil into the rock, that tends to restrict the current flow, and so the resistivity is higher. There's generally always some sort of water in the rock, some sort of conductive pathway over the surface of the grains, so it's very rare that rock and oil would be completely non-conductive. So generally the effect you see is an increase in resistivity due to the presence of the non-conducting oil. One of the things we've got to be a little bit careful about when we interpret resistivity logs, as I mentioned before, is that high resistivity may not be the result of oil saturation, the thing that we're looking for. Sometimes it's because the rock is tight. The low porosity end of the spectrum means that the resistivity is increasing, and that's one of the important things we need to know. That's why we need to know the porosity before we start our resistivity interpretation. We have to be able to distinguish low porosity, high resistive rocks from what we're really interested in, the high porosity oil bearing rocks. Okay, so now we make a measurement up through the wellbore with the resistivity commonly scaled to increase towards the right. And if we go up from the bottom here, we have some resistivity in the basement zone. It drops down a little bit into this conductive sand. It has some intermediate resistivity. Then we see that as we go into this tight limestone cemented, carbonate cemented interval, the resistivity increases. So you've got to be careful that you don't think, oh, is that hydrocarbon? No, you look over at the porosity curve and you see, oh, it's very low porosity. That's probably why the resistivity is increasing. Then we come into this porous zone and the resistivity drops right off. So that's what we're talking about. Really nice conductive, big pore space, lots of water volume here, and the resistivity drops right down, low resistivity, highly conductive with all that water in there. And as we come up into the oil leg, the resistivity gradually increases as we put more oil into the system, and then we have high resistivity. Now we're interested in this high resistivity because we know that the porosity is high as well, so this is looking good for hydrocarbons. Then as we go into the gas leg, we may or may not see another little kick over on the resistivity, an even bigger increase in resistivity across the gas cap. Then as we come into the shale over the top, the mud rock over the top, which contains a lot of water, oftentimes these are quite conductive, so the resistivity drops off again. So once we know the porosity and we make this resistivity measurement, we can hazard a guess that there's something in here of interest, hydrocarbons of some sort. Now, when we drill the well, we actually don't drill it with air, we drill it with what's called drilling mud. Now this drilling mud helps weighs back the formation fluids, stops them flowing into the wellbore. As we drill the well, the fluids are under pressure, and if we were just to drill a hole with air, for example, all of those fluids thousands of feet below us would actually start pouring into the wellbore and up the well pipe. And obviously everybody's seen those pictures of those old blowouts in the 1930s, oil gushing over the top of the derricks. Well, that's not a good thing. That's not a safe thing, and that's not what we do these days. So we have a drilling mud. It's a weighted system that as we drill through it cools the bit and keeps the reservoir fluids in the reservoir. But what tends to happen is that it seeps into the rock, as you can imagine. It seeps in like a sponge, and we get an invasion profile delivered. So here, let me just run that again. You can imagine that what I've illustrated here is that this poorer quality rock, we've got some level of invasion out to some depth, and then as we get into the better quality rock, this mud filtrate is pushing the oil the oil fluid away from the wellbore. It's sort of displacing it, and it seeps in deeper in good quality rock. In fact, that's not strictly always true. Sometimes poor quality rock, because of the way that the mud cake builds up, can develop quite deep invasion characteristics, because rather than building up a nice mud cake that stops further invasion, there's not good enough permeability to develop a good mud cake, and so the mud just constantly seeps in and you develop a really deep invasion profile. But for the purposes of this, we're just going to assume that for the better quality rock we get a deeper invasion, and that impacts our measurements, or can impact our measurements. Now this resistivity we measured here is a deep reading resistivity, so it's making its measurement right out here away from the wellbore, and it's getting its signal and measuring the resistivity out here, oftentimes away from the invaded zone. Now, if we make a measurement at various depths of investigation, from close to the wellbore to an intermediate place at the wellbore and then far away from the wellbore, we get a different resistivity profile depending on the amount of invasion that's gone on, and this can tell us something quite useful about the permeability, or hint to us where we've got good rocks. So let's make some measurements at various depths of investigation. So we might record the logs again, and let me just take you through here. So what we have down at the bottom in this particular zone, we've got the deep reading resistivity, the red curve, overlying with the medium reading resistivity. So the resistivity that's measured here at the medium investigation depth, and the one that's measured here out at the deepest investigation depth, is the same. The invasion hasn't reached out that far, so therefore the resistivity here and the resistivity here is the same, and the curves overlay. Now the very shallow reading resistivity, if this was a water-based mud, might be a little bit more resistive than the formation water, and with the mud filtrate effect as well, the mud cake build up, we might see a little increase in resistivity right here at the very shallowest depth of investigation. So then we log up here and we come into this tight carbonate cemented zone. Now here, if we say that the majority of this doesn't see any invasion at all, so the resistivity here and the resistivity here is the same, and pretty much the resistivity here at the wellbore is the same, then all the curves overlay. What I've illustrated here, these little notches, if you like, are the potential for little mud cake or borehole wall fractures, little cracks in the rock where you get a little bit of conductive fluid sitting in there, so you can actually maybe detect little fractures in the borehole wall. But in general, there's no invasion profile developed there. It's a tight, non-permeable rock. Then we come in here into the good porosity and inferred higher permeability water-bearing sand. Here we have the deep resistivity measuring out here, measuring the water, conductive water, low resistivity. Then we have, in the medium reading case, we have a little bit higher resistivity. So perhaps again we've got this case where this mud filtrate's gone a little bit deeper. It's actually affecting this middle reading tool, and has increased the resistivity a little bit, because the mud filtrate in this case is perhaps a little bit more resistive than the formation water. And then by the time we get to the borehole wall, we've got some higher degree of resistivity and mud cake interaction. But as we go up into the oil leg, we sort of see this profile flip around, because down here at the deep resistivity we're measuring high oil saturations, or high oil resistivity. That's the red curve. And then in here we're starting to see the effect of some mud filtrate. Now in comparison to the oil, the mud filtrate is more conductive, so actually it has the effect of reducing the resistivity relative to the original oil saturation. So we develop this sort of profile. And then of course, once we come back here at the shallow depth of investigation, we've got the lower resistivity, because the conductive mud filtrate has displaced the resistive oil away, and therefore the overall resistivity of the system is lower. So we see this nice big separation, which infers that actually originally the resistivity was out here with oil, but what we've done is we've flushed that oil away with a conductive mud filtrate, which gives us a good indication that actually this oil therefore is movable, and therefore that hints at some of the effects of permeability. So that's a nice thing. That's what we kind of look for. So if you like, we get an extra dimension. With the different depths of investigation away from the wellbore, we can tell things about how that fluid is moved, as well as what that fluid type is. Okay, and one of the other things we know about fluid is in gas-bearing rocks. If we have gas in a rock, and remember I put a little bit of gas at the top here, gas generally has a low hydrogen index. There's less hydrogen about the place, so therefore it's less dense. What often happens as well is, remember, when sonic waves travel in air, they're much slower, so we often see a decrease in density. The sonic is much slower through this gassy formation, and the neutron is also affected. The neutron is affected by the hydrogen index. It's a low hydrogen index, so we get a low neutron porosity. There's not as much water porosity, if you like, there in a gas zone. So what that sometimes looks like on a log is what's called the gas effect. Now, in this part of the world, which is in Europe, most of Africa, I guess, we tend to scale the logs on what's called limestone scales, but we scale them such that there is 3 or 4 PU's worth of difference here between the density and the neutron, and therefore that allows our geologists to colour them in, and we see an enhanced separation, if you like, in the gas zones. So clearly, as I mentioned before, I think that my colleagues over in North America, they tend to scale the logs such that they overlay, and any separation at all is an indication of gas. So here the fluid effect is having an impact, or the presence of a particular fluid types can have an impact on our overall log character as well. So that's an additional effect of the fluid.